Welcome, everybody, to Breaking Bread. Good to have everybody along, and great to have Brian Sutter with me today.
Good to be here, Matt.
Brian, our topic is apologetics. I want you to define apologetics, but also include, why this topic and why is this a term that we should probably know something about.
Right, yeah. So apologetics, the core of it is just to give a defense of something. So when it comes to Christian apologetics, it is giving a defense of the Christian faith, perhaps from different perspectives you can give that defense, but basically saying there is logical and reasonable reasons for believing that the Bible is true, that Christ is who he says he is in the Bible, and so on.
So I think when we look at the topic of apologetics, right, it's huge, right? Volumes have been written on there. Very talented, gifted people are out there in this space, right?
Right.
Okay. But we're not going to pretend to be them.
That's right.
Is that right?
That's right. I mean, there are just brilliant minds out there, and the depths of how they could speak into this are far beyond what we'll get into today. Yeah, I think our heart here with this, Matt, one would surely be that we would hope that this podcast series could be helpful to the student who's going into college and going to be facing, some challenges there, that it would be helpful to the parent who's trying to come alongside their college child that's going to be wrestling through that, as well as all of us as we walk through various doubts and challenges that arise in our own hearts, that it could speak into those too, as we no doubt all experience doubts, challenges, and we need support and help as we walk through those.
Logic and rationale is higher level thinking and develops at a certain point in a youngster's life, right?
Yeah.
And prior to that, there is a fair amount of rote memory, for example. So children memorize things and they learn things, and that's what the capacity that they're at early on.
Right.
Then they start to employ that with rational thinking skills.
Yeah.
So as you look at that, you can see then why this issue of faith comes to play with a youngster, right?
Yeah,
and as we grow up, and,
Sure.
and all of us, and wherever we're at.
Yeah. And I think with that, I think it should give parents, no matter what season of life you're in, or just even authority, confidence that no matter where a young heart is, to speak truth into them, and if it is at a very young age, and it is just that rote memory that's just there, and all the way up through college where they're maybe they have a faith, but it's about them taking that on as their own faith, and that's where apologetics can maybe shift even more into helping that youngster as that higher level thinking is coming on board. They're being able to think about abstract concepts and maybe getting challenged in ways they haven't before, that if they've got that foundation that you poured into them that was just part of mom and dad, but now it's becoming their own, and that can be a challenge sometimes.
Yeah, I've heard it said, and I think it's great, that God does not have any grandchildren.
That's right.
Either we are a son or daughter of His, or we are not. We don't come in on mom and dad's faith.
Yeah.
And that's a real issue, right? That is that we all come to a point where, do we believe?
That's right.
Or do we not believe?
Yeah. And I think we all, go through different, you might call crisis of faith, but particularly in those younger years where, that becomes a question that rises to the surface. Is this something that I actually believe, or is this mom and dad's, what they believe, or maybe the church leader or grandma or grandpa or whoever, and they have to wrestle through those things. So I think even for, whether it's a parent or leadership, to be able to come alongside those hearts and say, hey, if this happens, kind of proactively to invite them that, hey, I'd like to walk through that with you. I'm here. I may not have the answers, but I'd want to know what's going on if you're open to sharing that.
That this is something that, that we're willing to step into this space, right? And to talk about faith and talk about things that are hard to believe, or talk about these questions. And I know even from my own life, I can look back to seasons where I cycle through and work through issues again, right?
Yeah.
And work through issues of faith. Now, you tell me if I'm if I'm okay, you know what I'm saying? But I've taken that as the normal process of spiritual growth in terms of our faith.
Yeah, certainly. I would agree.
And a lot of people who have their pulse on Christendom and culture would say that Europe is very post-Christian, and a lot of the reason for that is that intellectualism or that rationalism, that they basically have evolved beyond the need for religion. And pundits would say that America is right on the doorstep of that.
Right, for sure. And that is, I think that gives us good reason to at least step back, take pause, and say, what are we going to do to equip our own heart, as well as particularly our youth and those going into the universities and things like that, to think through some of those pieces, whereas, maybe we didn't have to, or our parents' generation never faced those sort of things, and there wasn't quite the need there, but certainly is today, and it is kind of scary to think about where that's heading.
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear, too. 40 years ago, the main stream, the main current was a Christian worldview direction, right? Whether you're a Christian or not, you came to the same conclusions about various moral behaviors.
Right.
But a lot of that's being rocked today. We simply are not in that Christian worldview mainstream anymore.
No, it's one of those things we have certainly shifted into a postmodern worldview, and you can think of the postmodern worldview as essentially trying to say, is there any absolute truth, and really coming to the conclusion that there's not, that truth is relative and it's kind of up to each individual person. And that's in direct contradiction to the Christian faith and direct contradiction to what you're saying there. A generation ago, there would have been consensus, and most of that consensus would have fallen right in line, at least with the moral and behavioral teachings of the Scriptures.
So what we're really saying with apologetics is a defense of the faith. And so really what we're saying is faith can be defended. Right?
Yes.
And it seems to be that might be a little bit of a departure on what we think about what faith means.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and it's one of those things that certainly it's valid to be able to say you believe because you believe, and I think that's a very reasonable thing. But if you're talking to someone who's not grown up in a Christian home, who doesn't have any experience or background with, praying around the table and seeing some of those prayers come together and that experience, you may need logical or philosophical arguments to be able to say, this is why. There's more than just experience here. It's more than just I believe because I believe. There's other things as well that we can lean on.
I should just believe without evidence. Isn't that faith? Mm-hmm. But yet you're suggesting that I should consider the evidence for faith and have that in my repertoire.
Right, exactly. And just allowing for the possibility that somebody may need that. You may not, and that is wonderful. I think what a gift from the Lord. If you believe and you don't need those evidences, I think that is so exciting, and that's to be cherished and valued, but also to make space for the reality that your neighbor may need some evidence. Or, if your child's in college and they're getting challenged by a professor, that they may feel like they need some evidence for or be able to answer some of those questions. But certainly apologetics is not saying that faith isn't important or undermining that in any way.
I'd like to linger a little bit on that, Brian, in terms of, as a Christian, what should apologetics mean to us? How should we use it? Because I think a lot of times in the discussion of apologetics, that's a little bit glossed over.
Yeah.
And we really don't pause there. And I think you've hit on some of those things about my faith standing on its own and what part evidence plays and what part argument plays in my faith. After all, didn't Jesus say, blessed are those who believe who don't see, to Thomas?
Right.
And then he also says that, hey, if you got to believe for the work's sake, then go ahead and believe for the work's sake then, as kind of second-rate belief.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Sure, yeah. One of the things you and I have touched base on before is just this thing that we don't want to use apologetics to kind of prop up our faith, and, that can get us into trouble if we're kind of running around saying, okay, there's some evidence here and there's evidence over here, and that all may be helpful in the moment, but what happens in a new research comes out in a year and it is a little bit different, or you hear an angle from somebody that's something you haven't heard before, and it can be pretty dangerous to have your faith built up or propped up by apologetics, but certainly to have it other way around, where we have a foundation of faith and apologetics can bolster that or stand on top of
and
that.
give rise to worship then.
Yes.
And I wonder if that could be a lens as believers we should be thinking about. Study and know apologetics for the sake of worship. And to your point exactly, I had that experience. As a young person, I remember hearing one of the defenses of God is that the bumblebee or the honeybee couldn't fly.
Sure.
Okay? And how it mystified scientists, right? And it was a tremendous realization of how complex it is, right? And so as a young person, I had that belief. But fortunately, my faith wasn't in that fact.
Yeah.
Because that fact just recently got rewound. And scientists have discovered why they can fly. And instead of it eroding my faith because, now what?
Right.
It actually, I find it so fascinating because they're studying God's creation because they want to create little microscopic little bees that fly around with video and all these things. Anyway, they want to use it. But there's a very big departure and difference between that fact being what props up my faith and that fact being an article for worship.
Right.
Because that point hasn't changed. I still worship God for the mastery of the bee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great example, Matt, of kind of what we're talking about here. And we just want to encourage people that as we walk through life, there's going to be things that just are beyond man to understand, but God has also given us minds, and our understanding of the world is continually increasing and shifting and changing, but that's a gift from God. And as things are found out or things are seen through a different light, the world or the secular wisdom may tell us, well, that again tells us we don't need God or God doesn't exist. But the contrary, I think, can be true for the believer, where it says, wow, this is amazing. And look what God's shown us and how complex His world is. And we're just finding this out. And He's known this forever.
And we are continuing to learn as His creation, right?
Yeah.
What a phenomenal thing that we are going to continue to learn. Because as long as God is elusive in all that He has done beyond our knowledge, means that is going to be the margin that we have to grow and learn in.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, right.
So we can rejoice in these discoveries.
Exactly. You get into a discussion with somebody. If you do that for long enough, you're going to run into somebody who's smarter than you, who has more understanding than you, who has thought about something that you haven't considered. And if your whole faith is built on, well, I've always got the answer and I can always out-argue them, then what do you do on that Saturday morning when you run into somebody who has something you haven't really thought about?
And I think that's brilliant to think about, Brian, because that's exactly what we see is the church, the larger church, decries losing their faith, in their 20s or their late teens as they go to higher education, right? I think that's kind of what research and Christian research suggests, right? And a lot of that, I wonder, is exactly what you're saying, Brian, as if our faith has been propped up by these arguments that now get unwound as soon as somebody of higher credentials has a more persuasive argument.
Right.
So, to your point, what we're talking about here is not on individual arguments. We have to have a larger lens for apologetics.
Right, exactly.
Than the sum total of a bunch of arguments.
Yeah, yep. There's going to be times that maybe your mind's going to be awoken to some reality or truth that's outside of what the paradigm you've ever thought of. And again, that's the beauty of growing and becoming sanctified and understand God more fully, and that star that now you see that wasn't there before, it doesn't necessarily have to contradict everything you've had. It can be a fascinating thing to think about. How does this fit into the picture of God and His reality, even though it blows my mind?
Well, Brian, I think our listeners are saying, boy, you guys are doing a great job talking out of both sides of your mouth. On one end, we've talked about how it beautifully doesn't have to make sense, and we can say we don't know. And on the other end, we've entitled this, right, Apologetics, which is the defense or the evidence that we know it's right. Right? So, anyway, so now I'm going to kick it into your court. And you can...
Yeah. Well, I think that is. It's exactly, we're speaking out of both sides there, and we acknowledge that. And I think, we want to step into, apologetics and what that means and how to give a defense, but we just wanted to make sure, too, that we don't set people up to say that, to prop your faith up by apologetics solely and just see that can get you into trouble. So that makes sense.
What comes to me a little bit is putting a puzzle together, right? Yeah, you start putting a puzzle together, you don't see anything, right? You could be asked a question about, is it going to be this, is it going to be that, or how can this possibly, you're looking, I have no idea. And then all of a sudden another piece falls into place. And it's like, well, I do believe it's going to make sense because that one sure did.
Yeah.
And now that one sure did. And we're going to go our whole life without the picture completely. But the faith is that there is a picture there known by God.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I think from that perspective, one of the things I would just encourage the believer is just that for us to spend time in the Word is such an important piece of the puzzle. I mean, that if we have a strong picture of the Scriptures, and that's a foundation that we read those as they're true, and that begins to captivate our heart and mind. I mean, that's fundamental, that's going to be the best apologetic thing that we can do, is spend time in the Word, getting to know about it, having our hearts changed and molded by it.
In fact, the Word even says that faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. We've made a good start on the topic of apologetics, and hopefully a foundation has been laid for the topic, its purpose, its role in the life of a believer. But there's a lot left to say, and I hope you, our listeners, continue with us in upcoming episodes as we celebrate the evidence for faith and understand what a difference it makes in our lives. Have a good day.